Good evening, everyone. My name is Elise Carrier, and I am the Assistant Director of Graduate Admissions at Bay Path University. Tonight, the MS in Leadership and Negotiation at Bay Path and the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts presents to you a discussion on negotiating the non-negotiables in the Arab-Israeli conflict and beyond with Dr. Daniel Shapiro. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. First, I would just like to point out the question box on your screen. Please feel free to type questions here at any point during the presentation, and we will save some time at the end to answer them. Also, if you missed a portion of tonight's conversation or would like to share it with a friend or colleague who was unable to join us, I will be sending a link to the recording. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Josh Weiss. Dr. Weiss is the director of the MS in Leadership and Negotiation program here at Bay Path, as well as a member of the World Affairs Council of Western Mass. He is a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project and the co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative. Dr. Weiss is an international speaker, consultant, author, and valued member of the Bay Path community. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Weiss. Welcome.
Thank you, Elise. Hi, everybody, and welcome to what I'm sure will be a great talk. You know, it's a real pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dan Shapiro. I have had the privilege of knowing Dan for many years, and he's a terrific scholar and practitioner and a better human being. And I say that with all my affection for him. He's been a great friend over the years. Just a quick little background into Dan. He's got a very lengthy bio, and I'm going to share the highlights. He got his PhD up the road here at UMass Amherst, and Dan is the founder and director of the Harvard International Negotiation Program, an associate professor of psychology at the Harvard Medical School, McLean Hospital, and an affiliate faculty at the program on negotiation. Dan was named one of the top 15 professors at Harvard and specializes in practice-based research, which is building theory and testing it in real-world contexts. He's also launched successful conflict resolution initiatives in the Middle East, Europe, East Asia, and for 3 years chaired the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Conflict Resolution. And last but not least, he's written some really important books in the field of negotiation. Two of the most notable are Beyond Reason, that he wrote with Roger Fisher, about the role of emotions and how they can play a constructive role in negotiation and actually power us in many ways. And then the book that's most closely connected to this talk of negotiating the non-negotiables, how to resolve your most emotionally charged conflicts. So Dan's talk is going to center around this book and those lessons as it applies to a fairly simple kind of scenario of the Arab-Israeli conflict and beyond. So Dan, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your really busy schedule to do this, and I turn this over to you.
So thank you so much, Josh. Thank you first to all of you who are joining in. It honestly is painful for me that I cannot see any of you. I can't see your faces. We're not all together. So hopefully at some point, with the blessings perhaps of the World Affairs Council, Bay Path University, we might all come together in person to talk about today's topics more as well. But again, thank you so much to World Affairs Council, to Bay Path University for helping to make this happen, and a special thank you to you, Josh, as a colleague, a friend, and as a leader in this field of negotiation for the invitation to speak here this evening. So yeah, as you can see, the title of this talk is the simple, you know, obviously very humbling subject, negotiating the non-negotiable in the Arab-Israeli conflict and beyond, as though it's not enough to think about it only within the Israeli-Arab context. The conversation tonight, I will be bringing in some examples connected to my work in the Middle East, but it's going to be a much broader conversation, I hope, in that we'll be looking at theory and practical tools to better understand conflict of all types, whether in the difficult circumstances in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or here in the United States around issues of polarization and so on. So to start off, one of the things that's really struck me is, why is the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians continuing? You know, there are a massive number, a countless number of scholars and practitioners who have been trying to figure out how to deal with this conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for decades and decades. And yet, as hard as people try, the conflict continues. There are many different explanations for this, and the one that draws me most is that maybe, just maybe, the solution to the conflict or the way forward is not just in terms of dealing with its rational dimensions, but in dealing with the emotional and identity-based dimensions of this conflict. And so the purpose of my conversation with all of us tonight is twofold. It's to examine the role of identity in conflict resolution, again, looking to some degree at the Middle East, and two, to explore some strategies to counter some of the divisive dynamics that unfold when our identity gets hooked in a conflict situation. So for starters, before I even jump into the content, where do these ideas that I'll be talking about tonight, where do they come from? So these ideas come from many different places. First and foremost, from laboratory research that myself and colleagues around the world have done, trying to figure out, why do people get into these messy conflicts and what can we do to get out of them? Analyzing systematically within the laboratory context. But as Professor Weiss would vouch as well, my greatest learning comes not from the laboratory, but doing work in the real world. Taking theory, trying it out, seeing what works, what doesn't work, under what conditions. Just to give you a couple of examples, there's a workshop I did a few years back now in Jordan, at the Dead Sea in Jordan, with Her Majesty Queen Rania of Jordan. The topic we were dealing with here was a fascinating one. It was, how do you bridge the divides, the emotional divides, between what she was calling East and West, between the Arab world and some in the Western world. And she was quite taken by one of the frameworks that myself and Roger Fisher had developed a number of years back. That's what we were talking about at that session. I'll give you another example of some of the work I've done. This was a more recent session in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. I'm not going to say too much about this right now. We're going to come back to this example a little bit so you can learn more about what happened here and what the impact of that conversation was in terms of trying to move some sort of productive conversations forward in the Israeli-Palestinian context. And for all of you who are, continue to like me to be stuck at home, which I suppose is just about everybody in the world right now, I can promise you but one thing by the end of our time together. It is that my greatest learning, with all due respect to all these international leadership who I've had the privilege of working with and learning from, my greatest learning has not come from these high stakes negotiation contexts. It has come from negotiating with three of the hardest bargainers that you can ever imagine. And it is these dudes. I don't know how many of you listening in have things that look anything like this. Mine are roaming the halls right here outside my office door right now, but these are my boys. And Noah, the oldest there, Zachary, and then little Liam. I show you this picture to make note of this point that all of you who've taken a course on negotiation already know, that you have been negotiating since the day you were born and cried for milk. We are all negotiating all the time. We're dealing with conflict. What I found striking is that a lot of the dynamics that unfold at the larger international levels in high stakes negotiations replicate with much less magnitude and ultimate global impact at the local level as well. What happens, we're human beings in that sense. And human beings have conflict and we deal with it in pretty similar ways. The impact can be different, the complexity can be different, but it's still there. And so I invite you tonight, as we talk about different concepts of conflict resolution, think about a conflict from your own life. Think about a tough relationship that you are grappling with right now with a spouse, with a family member at home. As you're stuck day in and day out, how do you deal with conflict? How can you deal with conflict more effectively? And the specific challenge of tonight, it's this one. How should we bridge the divides emotionally? How do we bridge the divides in emotionally charged conflicts. I'm going to take us now away from what you see there on the screen, the American context, to the beautiful mountains of Switzerland, to Davos, Switzerland, where more than a decade ago, I was asked to do a little workshop there for a group of global leadership. We were meeting in a room, this was with the World Economic Forum in January in 2006. So way back in 2006, the world looked and felt very different back then. And I was doing a workshop on tribes, what I was calling tribes. And into our room came this picture is, I just found this today, in fact. This picture is from that actual session, more than 10 years back. But into this room at Davos, at this international conference, streamed 45 global leaders. We had a deputy head of state in the room. We had peace and security experts, an amazing artist. We had CEOs of Fortune 50 companies. They all come into this small room that you see there. And as they walk in one by one, we gave them a scarf of one of 6 different colors. You can see they're sitting at a table where their scarf's color matches the color of the lamp in the middle of their table. And so 6 tables were there, about 8 people per table. And I said to this group something that today seems like so obvious, it almost seems foolish to say it, but way back in 2006, it wasn't so. I said my belief that our world is becoming more and more tribalized. We're entering more and more of a tribal world. And I said, as much as our world is more and more interconnected, economically, politically, socially, technologically, that actually creates a challenge. How do we find our own place, our own sense of identity, when it's this expansive McDonaldization, when we are one whole singular global identity? My notion was that it's very threatening to people's sense of self, and we tend to retrench. We tend to move back toward what I call tribes. To me, a tribe is the beauty of life. A tribe is any group to which you feel some sort of kin-like connection. So it might be based upon religion. It might be based upon, Josh and I have the Harvard tribe. It connects us. We have the negotiation tribes. You have ethnic tribes, and on, any group to which you feel some sort of family-like connection. And I said to the group, you're going to have this wonderful opportunity today to create your own tribe, to create your own group that you can feel some connection with, sort of a sense of comfort and connection. And you're going to do so at your own tables. And I gave them a set of questions. I said, you need to answer all of these questions on this piece of paper through consensus to define the attributes of your tribe. They all said, fine. I said, you also are going to need to dress up in your tribal garb. What's the clothing that your group wears, that your family, your tribe wears? And I gave them some crazy materials to help them do that. They said, fine. Balloons, for example. So, 50 minutes later, everybody walks back into that room you see there, and they're all dressed up. You have the deputy head of state. He has a balloon on his head. I still have the picture. It is wonderful blackmail that I will never use, But anyway, 50 minutes later, the energy feels totally different in the room. They've all now identified with their own table as a tribe, and you can feel different energies at different groups. I stand in front of the room and I say, okay, let's debrief this exercise. And I know what they're thinking. They're thinking, my guess of what they were thinking is, boy, interesting exercise, but what's the point? Why are we doing this? And about 30 seconds later, in that room that you see there on that picture, there at Davos, the lights went black. And into the room, all of a sudden, burst an intergalactic alien. Obviously, this was a person dressed up as an alien, but the person walked in the room and said, I am an intergalactic alien. I have come to destroy the Earth. I will give you one opportunity to save this world from complete destruction. You must choose one of these 6 tribes, the 6 tables, to be the tribe of everybody. And if you cannot come to an agreement by the end of 3 rounds of negotiation, the world will be destroyed. You know, and out floats this alien, and as crazy as this all sounds, this group of global leaders, they took this exercise seriously. They said, we are going to save the world. There were 6 seats in the middle of the room. You can't see it here, but imagine the 6 seats in that slide there. In the middle of the room, a representative from each tribe comes to the middle of the room and they start negotiating. And round 1, no agreement. Round 2, no agreement. Time is ticking. They have 3 rounds. If they can't come to agreement by the end of 3 rounds, the world would explode. Round 3, they all come back. The leaders of each group come to the middle of the room, trying to negotiate which tribe is going to represent all tribes forevermore, for the future. And the moment they get to the middle of the room in this round 3, it just so happens the representatives, 5 men and 1 woman. The moment they get to the middle of that room, these men start yelling over one another. They start yelling over this woman who gets so rightly enraged that she literally stands on her bar stool, which we had in the middle of the room, and she yells, "This is just another example of male competitive behavior. You all come to my tribe." You know, she's shaking. Everybody's shaking. One other tribe joins her tribe. The others refuse. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boom. The world explodes. What happened? Over the course of 50 minutes, these global leaders created their own smaller group identities, their tribal identities. Those affiliations were so strong that they would rather cling to those identities than save the world. I've done this exercise now dozens and dozens and dozens of times around the world, in the Middle East, in the United States, at Harvard, in other universities, in Australia, with NGOs, with younger students, with people of great experience in the world, and so on, and almost without fail, the world explodes again and again and again. How do you make sense of this? And it is the first time I did this exercise, I won't go into the details now, was in Lake Ohrid in what was then called Macedonia, because it looked like there was going to be a civil war erupting there. I wanted those participants in this workshop representing different ethnic and political backgrounds to see what they were walking towards psychologically. Because I believe that this little tribal exercise, it ultimately becomes a microcosm of the challenges of large-scale identity-based conflicts. And what happens? My sense is that the moment that one's identity feels threatened, the moment someone says, "I like all schools but Harvard, I like all schools but Bay Path," the moment your identity feels threatened, religious, organizational, political, and so on, we tend to retrench. We tend to move back, and there's a mindset shift. And I call that mindset shift the tribes effect. We move toward a tribal mindset, but in a negative version of tribalism. And I see the tribal mind having 3 basic qualities. Think about a conflict from your own life right now. You know, you and mom, and you're stuck at home, and you love your mom, but you can't stand her right now. Or you and your kid, and you know, you are the mom or the dad, and you can't stand that kid right now. Everybody's in conflict. One can very quickly get into the tribal mindset, even with those we love. 3 characteristics. 1, it's adversarial. I love my 15-year-old who's on the other side of the door, just a couple, yards away. Tonight we got into a little conflict, but then the moment we got into that conflict, the tribal mindset entered our minds. It's adversarial. "Oh, now, Noah, it's me versus you." And he says, "Oh no, it's me versus you, Dad, and I'm twice as strong as you." We go, okay. But second, This mindset is self-righteous. I know I am absolutely right. Legitimacy is on my side, and you, other side, you're wrong, you're crazy, you're illegitimate. Third, this mindset is insular. It's closed. I will argue and defend my case to no ends, but I am going to close my ears to your perspective. This is what I saw unfolding in Davos. This is what I see unfolding in the United States today around polarization. This, in many ways, is a similar dynamic to what I've often witnessed unfolding as Israelis and Palestinians try to come together and to have a conversation. This is, in a sense, the gap, the psychological problem at a core. It is a mindset problem, and it's worse. I don't mean to make all of as if life is not challenging enough these days in the pandemic. I don't want to make things worse, but I do want you to, sort of want to share with you some of the things that I've become aware of that tend to move us deeper and deeper into the holes of conflict. And what I found happens is that this tribal mindset, it doesn't work alone. It has a whole set of envoys working for it. And I call these things the 5 lores of the tribal mind. My tribe, my familial sense of identity, I want to protect it. And if someone threatens me, here come the 5 soldiers to protect me. And I call those things lores because they're luring me toward that tribal mindset, to that place of defensive safety. 1, vertigo. 2, taboos. 3, repetition compulsion. 4, assault on the sacred. And 5, identity politics. So in what time we have left, I'm going to share with you a little bit about each of these 5 lores of the tribal mind, what it is, and how you might be more aware of it in your own life. And here's the key point. Awareness is power. The moment you know everything I'm going to talk about. I honestly don't think you're going to learn much of anything new. What I am offering is a framework to help you label, language to help you see you have choice when you are faced with conflict. And it's the same language that I've sought to equip Israeli and Palestinian leadership with, so that as they grapple with their challenges, they're less likely to fall for some of these traps. They can move forward productively. So let's start with the first of these 5 lores, vertigo. Vertigo, some of you might be familiar with it in the medical world. Vertigo there is a syndrome of dizziness, basically, not necessarily connected to heights. What I mean by vertigo is something similar but not the same. Think about the last time that you got into a really ugly conflict with somebody else. Family member, somebody at work. Vertigo is when you get so consumed in a conflict situation that you can think of nothing else other than that evil person who committed that awful act against you. And whether you are at work or whether you're at home, whether you're out for a walk, this conflict consumes you. You're in vertigo. This concept originally came to me many, many years back. It was my first year of undergraduate. I was at George Washington University. I was taking a class on the advancement of Western civilization. It was taught by 2 professors. One was this very esteemed rabbi, and he would sit there every class, dressed impeccably, posture perfect, language perfect. And the co-professor, co-teaching the class, was an English scholar who was as eccentric and non-traditional as you can imagine. Every class he would sit there, his leg would be propped up, his hair would be sticking up, and he'd be playing with it. Every other word out of his mouth was a swear word that would make the rabbi, whoa, flinch a bit. One day, this, wonderfully inspiring English professor, an intriguing English professor, he walks into our class. And I don't know the context. I'm not sure he knew the context, but he says to the whole class, I had the worst fight with my wife this weekend. Now our entire class is very interested. We start leaning in. He says, I was at the mall with my wife. We were both there. And he said, we started arguing over a bedspread. He said, my wife desperately wanted to buy this $500 bedspread for our bed. And I said, this is the stupidest financial decision we can ever make. He said, we started getting into an argument more and more and more in the mall. And then he said, as we're in the midst of this argument, just for a moment, my eyes averted those of my wife. He said, I saw a whole circle of onlookers watching us fight. I hadn't even noticed it. He said, I looked down at my watch. 20 minutes had passed. I thought it was 2. This is vertigo. There is a collapsing, a transformation of time and space. All that we can see in terms of time, in terms of space, the field around us is that conflict situation. And I must say, just as a side note, boy, it is easy to get into vertigo as we are all stuck at home during this pandemic. The ability to acknowledge that, to recognize, wait a minute, I'm moving toward vertigo is our power. Let me give you an example and now connect it to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It was about 2 or 3 years ago. I was working with a group of senior Israeli and Palestinian diplomats, and we were talking about vertigo, some of these other concepts. I get an email from one of these participants about a week later, and she says, I was there this past week at the negotiation table. It was an informal table, but it was, I won't say which side was which, but I was, one side of the conflict negotiating with people from the other side of the conflict. She said, at first we had a very pleasant conversation until we started talking about the deeper, more sensitive political issues. She says at that moment in time, I felt my shoulders go up. And she then said in this email, I saw that little whirlwind, that tornado of vertigo coming toward me. In other words, she was about to get so consumed in the conflict that rational thinking might have walked out the door. She then noted in the email that she asked herself one single, simple question. Do I really want to go there? Do I really want to enter that all-consuming psychological syndrome of vertigo? She said to herself, no, I don't. I don't think it will be constructive. And she had a much more productive conversation then. Simply by naming, by recognizing and then naming this phenomenon, it provides us with tremendous power to decide how we want to deal with it. Rather than being reactive to our own subjectivity, we can now be proactive, treating what is subjective as something objective. That's vertigo. Okay, I could go on, but I can't see your faces, so I don't know where you're at. You're probably like, this is boring, let's keep going. So I will keep going. Let's move to the next of these lores. So the second of these lores, taboos. Taboos are social prohibitions. These are things that we're not supposed to think about, we're not supposed to talk about, we're not supposed to do. Every society, every household has taboos. My mother is just very affectionate. She hugs everybody. She's very emotionally attuned. My father, extremely loving person, but it was always taboo in our house to hug my father. And it was extremely uncomfortable. You go try and hug him and he's just like sort of like a robot there. It's a hug, Dad. It's like, yes, I know. But taboos. Taboos play out in all contexts. Again, social prohibitions. What should we be talking about, for example, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we're not? And what shouldn't we be talking about that we are? As to the latter, let me give you an example. It was a while back. I have a relative. I should guise this a little bit just to save them here. I have a relative who's very close with her sisters, and advising them on all different kinds of things. Everybody's advising everybody. And one day, this relative offered advice to one of her sisters on how to deal with the sister's husband. That was the big no-no. You know, the sister said, you can give me advice on anything and anybody, on my children, on my friends, but don't you go near my husband. And this relative who had offered the advice suffered a consequence, a punishment, not being able to talk. The relative didn't talk to this relative for about a week. Taboos. Taboos are social prohibitions, and if you break one of those taboos, you might watch out because you're likely to suffer some sort of consequence. Let me give you an example. I'll skip this one for the moment. It was way back in the year 2010, I believe it was, that the Obama administration launched a set of direct negotiations between Israel, the Palestinian National Authority, that's right, under Chairman Abbas at that point in time. And these negotiations persisted for some time, but they ultimately failed. And the word on the streets, the word across the political and street realms within the Middle East was, you know, once again, everybody tried, but this thing is impossible to resolve. So don't even try. My notion was, well, if you think it's impossible, you're not going to try anything and you will build a self-fulfilling prophecy. Nothing will happen. And so I started building a back channel effort, bringing together Israeli, Palestinian, and international leadership, some political, primarily business leadership, and said to them, let's figure out how we can try to break the impasse between Israelis and Palestinians. This led to a very substantial initiative that brought together ultimately hundreds of senior level people from across these societies, but it was all behind the scenes. And miraculously, this did not get leaked as far as I know. And the actual announcement of this project came at the World Economic Forum. And, oh, I'm going to get my date wrong, but I think it was the year 2012. No, sorry, 2013. So it's the year 2013. We now had about 300 Israeli, Palestinian, international leadership representing about 25% of the GDP of that region, all together for this conference with the World Economic Forum. And it was about to be announced. You see the image there in front of you on the screen. It's about to be announced to over 1,000 senior leadership from across that region with the media there. You had many, many leadership in that room. Tony Blair, then with the quartet. You had Abbas, you had Perez there as well, the King of Jordan, and on and on. This project, the goal again was to help break the impasse between Israelis and Palestinians. Let's get the conversation officially going again. One of the leaders of the forum stands in front of this entire group and says, we have been working on this international initiative for quite some time. We're now publicly introducing and launching this initiative. And then he said, everybody who has been involved in this initiative, who stands behind it, would you now please rise? In that room you see right there. This was the moment of taboo for both Israeli and for Palestinian. For an Israeli and a Palestinian, there can be severe consequence for showing that you're working with the other side. I happen to be sitting by odd chance. An esteemed rabbi was on my one side, an esteemed imam was on the other side. The moment the head of the forum in the front of the room said, would everybody who was involved in this please stand, there was this moment of dead silence. Nobody moved. And then all of a sudden, in this, to me, magical moment, you had more than 250 senior leadership, Israeli, Palestinian, international, all rise together in support of trying to break the impasse between Israelis and Palestinians. This moment in time never got the media attention I thought it deserved because this was a moment of huge courage. It was breaking a taboo in order to move forward opportunities and conditions for constructive negotiations. About a month later, in large part due to what happened there in this room and a lot of the energy behind the scenes connected to it, official negotiations launched again. And again, I think this was 2013, if I'm getting my dates correct, but you know the rest of the story. About 9 months of very almost relentless negotiations. John Kerry was in charge of these negotiations, meeting, I think it was something like 60 times with Netanyahu, about 30 times with Abbas. And at the end of all of that, 9 months later and much beyond, including all of the time it took to get everybody to the table, after all of the celebrations that ensued on this day where we did break the taboo, it ended up with this. Another political negotiation failure, and it is in 2014. Why? One can offer many valid reasons why, but one I would now like to call attention to is the third of these things that pull us toward a tribal mindset in its negative sense, and that is the repetition compulsion. It is the idea, so the repetition compulsion, this is an idea that originally it was formulated by Sigmund Freud. He was working with many different groups, and he started to notice a pattern that people in some very distressing relationships, domestic abuse, abusive workplace relationships, he noticed that they tended to move from one of those abusive relationships to another and another and another. His whole theory of psychology was basically that we are moved toward pleasure, the pleasure principle, and we're moved away from pain. We want to get away from pain, but he could not figure this out. He said, well, why? Why are these women in these abusive relationships, everyday people of all kinds, men and women in other kinds of relationships, moving from one destructive to another destructive relationship? It's not just pleasure. It's not pleasure. His explanation was what he called the repetition compulsion. It's complicated. I won't go into the details now, but the basic idea, this is my version of the theory, not his, is that all of us at points tend to repeat the same dysfunctional patterns of behavior again and again and again, even though we know we shouldn't. This was me tonight with my son, Noah. I asked him a question. He responded back very curt. We get into an argument. I could feel this well of emotions in my body, wanting to yell at him, why can't you talk to me? And if I did follow through with those emotions, we would have walked right back into the same pattern that we knew all too well, our own little cycle of discord. In my mind tonight, as I was driving him to an exercise facility that he goes to, I felt that well of emotions. I labeled it. I said, Dan, you're about to walk into the repetition compulsion. Like vertigo, do you really want to go there? And I said to myself, no. Took a deep breath. Okay, Noah, you have a choice. How should we move forward and deal with this situation between us? And I was much more focused. And it was a much more productive conversation. Repetition compulsion happens in the international sphere as well, especially when you have traumatized societies. And one can almost predict with a fair amount of precision what's going to happen a year from now, 2 years from now, connected to the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Who's going to say what, then what's going to happen in return? This is all a predictable pattern with an emotional base, repetition compulsion. The power of labeling repetition compulsion is that we can actually then figure out, well, what is that pattern? Might I change one small piece of that pattern? Before I respond to Noah with some paternalistic response, an aggressive response, well, maybe I'll take a deep breath. Maybe I'll ask him a question. Maybe I'll avoid the conversation altogether. Understanding that pattern brings you power. That's the repetition compulsion. And if you are not aware of it, boy, it very quickly can bring you back toward that tribalistic mindset. fourth, and let me see time here. Okay, I'm just gonna go for a few more minutes, and then I'd love to hear your questions, your thoughts, your criticisms, all of that. But I'm gonna skip this for now. I'm gonna go to the fourth of these lores of the tribal mind, and it is what I would call an assault on the sacred. The moment I say something or do something that threatens that which you consider to be most sacred in the world, we are back in the tribal mindset. The moment that I threaten some element of your sacred beliefs, of your sacred rituals, of your sacred allegiances, any of that, now it's me versus you, and we are in that tribalistic us versus them mindset. I don't see the sacred as being only, the way I'm using the word, it's not just that which is religious per se. Anything to which you hold some sort of deep meaning, allegiance to, sacred in that sense. And the big idea here, if we want productive conversation, to the extent possible, respect that which people consider sacred, don't assault it. And then the fifth of these lores, these things that pull us toward that mindset of us versus them at a deeper level, is identity politics. We hear a lot about identity politics in the media these days. I'm using it in a slightly different sense than that which it is typically used in the media. To me, identity politics is the shaping of people's identity for some political purpose. It's President Milosevic in Serbia way back in 1989 saying to Serbians, we lost a battle at this particular grounds 500 or so years ago. We will not do so again. We must fight for what we believe in. But who's the we? The we is a designated set of constituents he's trying to enlist for some sort of political purpose, ultimately war. Identity politics. And boy, looking at the United States context right now, many politicians and many in the media, many of the rest of us are very good at using identity politics to divide. The power, in my opinion, of identity politics is you can use the same concept, the same tool to unite. Think about Mandela, walking out of prison after all of those years. And what was one of the first things he does? He goes and has lunch with the widow of the president who had originally imprisoned him. And he says, and what's he trying to say with that largely symbolic action? He's trying to say, we must come together as a united South Africa to move forward. It is not about white or colored or black. It is we, all of us together. Powerful message. It's what I call the relentless we. And to me, he embodies as much as enacted that concept. So the problem, I think, with identity politics is that we often craft our relationship to the other side in a conflict as negative. So how do you define a Democrat? Well, they're not a Republican. How do you define a Republican? Well, they're not one of those Democrats. Boy, it's not a very good way to define your identity, because if the conflict ever stops, you no longer have an identity. It's an existential crisis. If I define myself as being the opposite of you, negative to you, the moment that you disappear, I have no more identity. My suggestion in conflict situations, who are you? What do you stand for? Who do you want to be in our society right now, in the Israeli, in the Palestinian, in the shared future possibilities? What identity do you want? Move toward that. Don't focus on the negative identity. And you put this all together, just to wrap this up. And the big points of all of this, how do you bridge the divides? We need the rational thinking. We need to understand what people emotionally are feeling, but it's the identity that I think is the most important. And if that identity feels threatened, we move toward that tribal mindset, and 5 lores are very good at moving us there. If we want to be constructive in our dialogue, 5 things. Stop vertigo before it consumes you. Government leaders have great power to do so. 2, resist the repetition compulsion. Know the likely scenarios that might unfold and stay tuned to what you're feeling. Stay attuned to what you're feeling and move in the direction that makes most sense toward your purpose, toward a positive vision. 3rd, deal wisely with taboos. What should we be talking about? What shouldn't we be talking about? Wait a minute, we're not talking about the refugee issue. We're not talking about the settlement issue. We're not talking about whether it's okay to use the name Israel or Palestine. Might make sense to figure out some ways that we can talk about that, which is often unspeakable. Otherwise, how can we resolve the conflict? 4th, respect the sacred. Don't assault it, again, to the extent possible. And 5th, use identity politics to unify. So, I mean, just to close up, at the end of the day, I think the bigger point is embolden that famous Lincoln phrase, the better angels of our nature. Recognize when you start moving toward that us versus them mindset, ask yourself, do you want to go there? And commit to a broader sense of identity as an us rather than just a me versus a you. So with that, I would love to hear your questions. I don't know if there's a chat or not. I'm in this strange, I guess not Zoom, but GoToWebinar world where I'm watching myself talk at you right now. It's a very interesting way of having a conversation. Anyway, Josh, if you're there anywhere, or at least I'd welcome your direction on next steps.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Shapiro. And we do have quite a few questions.
Great.
Okay, so the first one, where does national cultures, which is significant in both political and business negotiations, come into play with your approach to negotiating?
Where do national cultures come into play? Oh, I mean, in a huge way. I think it's the basic notion is that we all have, multiple senses of identity. I am a professor, I'm a father, I'm a son, I am, live in the United States, so I'm a US citizen, and so on. If I'm negotiating with somebody else, those are important elements of who I am, of my identity, and I want them affirmed. Just as true, somebody who I'm negotiating with might have a very different national background, national cultural background. Their identity is important to them just as much as my identity is important to me. We walk into the negotiation, and if I start explicitly or subtly or even unintentionally demeaning their national culture, their national identity, now we're moving toward that tribal mindset. Now they don't like me, they don't trust me, and understandably so. I am disintegrating, at least from my own words, their notions of identity, or I'm not affirming them. And we descend. The more one is aware of your own identity, the more power you have, and the more you are aware of the identity of the other, the more power you have. One last thought on that. This is why I think it is essential, especially in high stakes negotiations, for parties to meet prior to any formal political conversations and to get to know one another. The more I know the other side personally, who they are, what they stand for, what they care about, the more they understand that about me, the more we can actually ally together. It's the two of us together, and not just me intentionally or unintentionally offending the other side. And I don't know if, well, you said we have a lot of questions. I should stop. I had a story about that. Yeah.
Oh, do you want to continue? Go right ahead.
Okay. So yeah, this was how many years back? I'd say a while back. I do a lot of work in the Middle East. I am still learning so much about the Middle East. I'm a complete novice, but completely, intrigued with the beauty of the cultures there, the richness of the cultures. It was a number of years back. I was doing a workshop for some senior Arab leadership, and it was a group of, I'd say, about 15 in a beautiful room. And these diplomats were sitting in basically a U-shaped with chairs there. I'm in the front of the room, and we've been having this wonderful rapport between us. We were debriefing an exercise. There was just energy, positive energy there. And we're talking, and all of a sudden, everybody stopped talking. And the energy just stopped. And I was like, what happened? A few minutes later, I take a break because I realize something is going on and I don't know what it is. We take a break, and one of the participants bravely comes up to me and says, Professor, I just want to let you know that toward the close of our session just now, as you were sitting in front of the room, you crossed your one leg over the other, and the sole of your shoe was facing one of the participants who happens to be a member of the royal family in our country. And I said, oh, I said, I absolutely did not intend for that to happen. And as all of you probably know better than I did at that point in time, it's a deep insult to show the sole of your foot, the sole of your shoe to somebody else in many of the Arab cultures and other cultures as well. What do you do in that circumstance? This was an offense to the culture of the other, to the respect of the whole social structure. I come back after the break, take a deep breath, and I apologized. I said, I am so sorry. This was not my intention to commit any offense. It was I've learned through this incident. I hope you will forgive me. And this very generous member of the royal family looks back at me and says, of course. I'm walking out of that session later on that afternoon, and this diplomat, the royal member of the royal family, he comes up to me and he says, you know what, Professor, you really didn't need to apologize. What did I hear him saying? I heard him saying, thank you very much. I deeply appreciate you respecting me and my culture. So I don't think there's any wonderful prescriptive advice that's not going to get you in some holes at some point in time. I do think that the answer to a lot of those problems is to be honest, truthful, and human.
Awesome. I'm so glad you shared that story. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Can we ever get the far right and the far left to get started to work together?
I think the answer, God, this is where I would love to hear your opinions. My instinct right now is, what do you think? But I don't know who you are right now. I am an optimist by nature. I'm also a realist, usually, but I do think we can. Part of my philosophy, again, is if you think it's impossible, nobody's going to do anything and nothing will happen. You'll end up being right, and you'll wrong the country. In fact, I'm just publishing an article. I just finished up an article last night at 2:30 in the morning that was due today on something I'm calling, it'll be published in a few months in the Harvard Negotiation Law Review, on what I'm calling reconciliation systems design. It's the idea that all too often as people are thinking about how do we help people reconcile, whether in post-conflict, post-violent conflict situations or in very polarized societies, people very quickly move toward the development of healing mechanisms. You can almost envision that in a presidential administration. Well, there's polarization, there's political, there's racial, there's this. What do we do? What are some healing mechanisms that we could create? Well, we could create, how about reparation? Yeah, that's a good one. What do we do there? How about some truth commit? All perhaps very good ideas, but the question is, how do those ideas get created? And as far as my research has been able to discover, I found no guiding system for people to think methodically, systematically about how to create the most useful reconciliation mechanisms that best match the divides within society. This is a long-winded answer to your question. I don't think there's, well, I think there could be some simple solutions. Just get people from the far left and the far right, bring them together, have them do a dialogue session. I'm not sure that's gonna fix the problems. I think it's a much deeper set of issues at play. Dialogue might be a part of it, but dialogue must be in conjunction with a number of other healing modalities so that a country like ours can most effectively work toward building reconciliation.
Thank you. Any thoughts on the trade agreements emerging with Israel, UAE, and other Arab and others in the Arab community, and what has allowed these to emerge?
Yeah, so I'd be hesitant to speak or reluctant to speak more specifically to the politics per se. The way I would think about it from a negotiation perspective is, where's the opportunity? Where is the opportunity for bringing it? So again, keeping with the topic of tonight's conversation, the Israeli-Arab or Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where are the places of opportunity, spaces that might have emerged that may now be existent that weren't existent before, that can allow more positive movement toward ultimately reconciliation, negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. Might, for example, there be ways to build further business relationships between those in the Arab world, those in the Israeli context, and at the same time, perhaps building some sort of energy toward Israeli-Palestinian negotiations with the business communities moving behind them, helping to support that. We'd have to brainstorm. But the big question to me really would be, okay, this is now the de facto political reality. Where are the opportunities for movement? Where is the political space to do so? I think the fact that, just this is a corollary notion, I think the fact that the world right now is so focused on the pandemic, it's good for purposes of the pandemic. In terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, many people will say that's bad. It's no longer a priority within the US administration, obviously less of a priority even in the Middle East, in many parts of the Middle East. Might there be an opportunity there? The moment that there's less focus on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what that also means is that spoilers have less power. There's more space to actually try things out, that might be a little taboo in other circumstances, bringing people together that in other circumstances, if done, might yield negative repercussions.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions, if you don't mind.
That's great. No, it's great to hear the questions. Yes.
Okay, within an emotionally charged situation, what's your advice for negotiating with a non-responder? Not necessarily someone who is being difficult, but someone who isn't engaging in a meaningful manner with you.
I'd want to know why. There are a lot of possible reasons why. Let me give you some possible ideas. So really the question is why. It's doing some sort of functional analysis. Why are they resisting talking with you? Is it that they think that talking with you is going to result in negative consequences for them? Is it that they're anxious to talk with you? They just have negotiation phobia? Is there a history of negative dynamic between you and that other party? Is it that there's some issue that is unconnected to you? They're having a fight with somebody else that makes them just overwhelmed right now during the pandemic. And in other words, there are a lot of possible reasons why somebody might not respond to an invitation to dialogue or to negotiate. In a book that Roger Fisher and I wrote, now many years back, way back in 2005, called Beyond Reason, we look at that question sort of. We look at how to deal with emotions in negotiation, and we suggest that a useful way of dealing with emotions is to focus not on every single little emotion that somebody's feeling. In other words, person X is non-responding to me. I'm not going to try and become Freud and figure out, well, are they angry? Are they resentful? Are they annoyed? Are they enraged? You don't need to do that. we found that there are 5 basic core concerns, 5 core concerns, basic human motivations that tend to stimulate a lot of the emotions that we feel. And if you, the person who asked the question, you might want to think about these core concerns as a way of trying to diagnose, why is this other person not talking to me? Let me share the 5 really fast. 1, appreciation. Maybe they just don't feel appreciated by you. You know, my son Noah, as much as I was hard on him tonight, maybe he says, you know what, my dad just doesn't appreciate me as much as I want him to, and I'm going to shut him out of my emotional life. Appreciation. Second of our core concerns is autonomy, the freedom to make decisions without somebody else imposing a decision on you. So maybe that other person who's not responding to you feels that you might be threatening their sense of decision making. If I try to talk with you, you're going to tell me what to do once again. Might as well not even talk to you. Third of these core concerns that drive our emotions in negotiation, affiliation. What's the emotional connection like between you and that non-responder? Does that person hate you? Is it an adversarial relationship? And how might you be able to reframe the relationship? Look, I know we're not talking very well recently, but what's your advice on how we can deal with this situation better? Not talking, not good for you, it's not good for me. This is what I actually said to my son tonight. I said, look, you know, we can have a miserable conversation tonight, but is that the kind of relationship that you want? Is that the kind of relationship that I want? I don't have control over what you are thinking or feeling or how we can act, but you know, it's really your choice. Autonomy. The fourth of these core concerns is status. Another reason that one might not respond. Status is all about who's up and who's down. Might that other person feel like you keep talking to them in this belittling voice, you know, and you treat them that they're like they're a little kid, even though that's not your intention. Their status might feel demeaned. They're not going to respond. Or fifth, role. What role might they feel cast into? Maybe the two of you, you and the non-responder, spouses or good friends or colleagues, whatever it is, but suddenly they feel cast into a role that they don't like. They're the bad guy or they're the aggressor. Why do you keep treating me like the aggressor? It's not who I am. And potentially unintentionally perhaps, they might see you as putting them into a role like that you just don't like. I'm not going to respond. You know, so there are a lot of possible reasons. I think the best you might do is just to really think through what might be going on emotionally from that other person's point of view. Why aren't they responding to me? And those are some ideas.
Super, thank you.
Thank you.
Can any of these tribal concepts be used in the positive to help change the dynamic in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yeah, I agree with you, whoever asked this question. I think generally a very positive person, but all of these lores are really sort of negative. You know, stop vertigo, repetition compulsion, they're like all like, oy vey. It's a lot to deal with here. Each of them, I think, has its positive element as well. I think about, you know, vertigo often in the negative, you're falling deeper and deeper into the, you know, what is it, Alice in Wonderland, she's falling deeper and deeper into that hole. But you also, all of us, it's, you know, hopefully at some point in our lives, we fall in love. Vertigo can be a positive. We've all had that experience where we're so involved in some sort of conversation or project or late night conversation that it's a flow, as one famous psychologist, Csikszentmihalyi, calls it. We get in that flow, sort of like a positive vertigo. You know, and one might ask, what can be done? What kinds of situations and conditions can be established where we can bring, let's say, Israelis and Palestinians together, and they get into that positive state? And I've seen it happen through the work that I, you know, that, for example, that I do with them. We'll go on. We've had workshops in very exotic places. Nobody's there. And there are moments where all of them just like relax their shoulders, they take a deep breath, they see each other as human beings, and they get absolutely engaged together in a positive vertigo. Taboos is another one. You know, I talked tonight about taboos in the negative. Taboos are really useful to keep our world in place. You know, my son and I got into that argument tonight. If I disagree with them, I don't say, you know, Noah, you're wrong, man. I don't just give him a punch. It is taboo to do so. It's taboo to start a war without any sort of provocation. There are a lot of taboos that actually are quite useful for our world, positive taboos. And I mean, look at what's happening between the left and the right in the United States right now, and even internally between the right and between the left in the United States. All of the taboos, the restrictions on aggressive political conversation have been utterly relaxed. Maybe we need to figure out how can you start to bring some of those taboos back so that civic conversation, civilized conversation becomes the norm. Taboos can protect that. They become the fence of, you know, sort of the electric fence. You can't go past that or else you're going to get a big shock. Sacred, another one. I think, Josh, I know you're here, Professor Weiss, somewhere in the internet sphere. There you are. But I think about the project that you have been helping to pioneer around the Abraham path. And in my own theoretical world here, that's using the sacred for the positive. It's thinking through, well, what is a sacred that each of the major Abrahamic religions shares? What is a sacred? Well, it's Abraham. Everything traces back to Abraham. Might we be able to use that, you know, ostensibly mythic, sacred story to help connect people? And the project that you've done is just spectacular. And I think the power of a project like that is in part due to the holistic story of it all, that it moves back to a sacred myth. And I don't mean to say that myth might not be something that somebody believes as absolutely true, but it's a story that has these deep and sacred elements to it. Identity politics, once again, it's another way that we can use these concepts in the positive. You know, I think how everything today, you know, is politicized. The word unity is a politicized word, and so on. I was at a talk just a couple nights ago. Someone said he had written a memo to the Biden administration urging them not to use the word unity because it has such a political connotation now. You know, the right, some would say, think, well, unity means uniformity. It's not my notion of unity. From my perspective, I still think something like, you know, arguing for unity again and again and again and again, bringing energy and voice to that is essential to moving the left and the right into a place of constructive dialogue. I just lost my train of thought. This is COVID thought. I don't have the virus right now, as far as I know, but welcome to our weird, strange world, mental world. Yeah, I do remember now. It's one last thought in the positive. You look at the United States as an example. How much energy are we investing in the negative? Look at the nature of the algorithms on the major, Facebook and so on. Look at the nature of the rhetoric that politicians across the divide are utilizing. Look at what we're all talking about, even what I'm talking about tonight. It's tribalism, it's political tribalism. We're feeding the negative. And it's just like a little, scale. The more you feed the negative, the more it wins. I think we need to really feed the positive. It is us, us, us. Doesn't mean there's not a me. It doesn't mean there's not a tribe that is important, my tribe, your tribe, but we need to feed the positive. That's identity politics in the positive identity. Ubuntu, that famous phrase, in itself a mythic phrase that Desmond Tutu advocated for, that sense that I am connected to you, you are connected to me. I am not an identity if not with you. If I got that right.
Okay, and we have one last question, if you don't mind, Dr.
Sure.
Shapiro.
This is great.
What factors, in your opinion, have contributed to the recent success in negotiations between Israel and Arab countries like the UAE under the Abraham Accord?
You're trying to get me political again. I guess, you know, anybody observing the situation as a profession would state that there's been a lot of ongoing relationship between Israel and many of the neighboring Arab states for many, many years. You know, there have been some quiet business transactions that have been going on for many, many years and so on. I think the sort of the political shape of the region toward the close of the Trump administration helped, I think, to move that conversation forward in many ways. I don't know, Josh, what do you think? You're going to have a better answer for this than I will, because you're moving now to much more to the political analysis than to the psychological analysis. And my comfort zone, I think, is much more in the psychological analysis. How do you help bring people together than the, well, why did this political situation happen?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in some ways you're right that some of those informal contacts have been there, but I also think that um, you know, there was an opportunity to try to, and I think, as you also pointed out, the limelight is not so uh, focused on the region. You know, it's focused elsewhere with COVID and Trump commanding the spotlight and things along those lines. And so I think these were deals that could happen that could, on some level, break one of those taboos or some of those taboos that exist in the region, which is, you know, having a relationship with Israel on some level for Arab countries, right? To me, the UAE Accord, the Bahrain Accord, the Accord with Sudan, they were all, I mean, these are all small countries, small players in the region. The question for me was always, is this trying to lead to something bigger? Is this trying to lead to a Saudi Arabia or another entity that might dramatically change the landscape in the region?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, you know, again, they were also very practical. You know, they were trade agreements. There were, you know, planes involved related to defense and things along those lines. So there was very much a practical element to this as well, that they felt like, hey, this is something we can get done. It's something that can actually maybe begin by creating a little bit of momentum. You know, and I think when you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there are a lot of folks, including myself, who believe that in order to really solve it, you're going to need a regional effort. And this may have also been another element of bringing that regional piece to play, because the parties themselves are not moving very far, you know, and there's not a whole lot to compel them at the moment to move. So that would be my analysis. But, you know, Dan, I wanted to ask you a question, which is, you know, you mentioned Mandela, and you know, a lot of times when I talk about Mandela, people say, yeah, well, Mandela, right? I mean, he's Mandela, he's a unique figure. But I'm wondering if you could share, I mean, you've done so much work at the political level with different politicians and others. I'm wondering if you could share maybe a story about a politician or somebody who really embraced this idea, because often we see politicians, and you know, a lot of times they are dividing us in a way that isn't always so helpful. And I'm curious if there are folks who, you know, when you worked with them around these things, sort of were really able to make a shift and realize how much of an impact they have on situations, and were willing to take, you know, maybe use the political will to do something a little different.
Yeah. I remember working, I know you've done much of this work as well, Josh. I remember years back, one of the first times I was working with an international leader, a head of state, and I was scared to death. And I still get anxiety, but I was scared to death. And my notion was that these leaders have this, you know, they're again, these mythic characters, they're above us, you know, mortal human beings. And when I met in private with this leader, he leans in and he says, so tell me your advice. Tell me what you think I should do. And he was so open to listening that it shocked me. And in fact, it humbled me
Mm.
through that process. The I've also realized that these leaders are tremendously busy. You're thinking about President Biden right now in his first days in office. There are a million streams of paper coming toward him. A million people want his attention for good purposes, for spoiler purposes, for all of it. And it's often those people who are surrounding the leader that may be the best avenues to help move a constructive conversation forward. So, for example, I had done some work with, at the invitation of the Obama administration, with their speech writing team. How might they develop speeches that could assert this concept of positive identity politics? Working with chiefs of staff of these leadership, or those who are in charge of security, for example, and helping them to shift their perspectives just a little bit so that now they have a choice. I think the problem, in a way, is that we think that there's this interminable opposition between focusing on unity and focusing on politics. I don't think that's true. I think one can be very deft and aggressive politically and still cling to an image and concept of unity. There's a core concept that I think drives us as human beings in our relationships. It's twofold. And Josh, I won't go on too much with this, but just like what defines human relationships, I think it's two things. On the one hand, it's affiliations. Josh, with you and me, it's what defines me. In part, it's that connection with you. I know you. We've worked together. It's that human connection. That can be good. That can be bad. If we got into an argument, the second part of what defines a relationship is autonomy. It's the freedom for me to be who I want to be without you imposing any sort of vision of behavior upon me. And people often, I think that those two things come in opposition to one another. The more interconnected we are as a single United States, well, the more we're going to lose our cultural heritage. I don't think that's true. So I think there are ways that we can emphasize the collective, the civic mindedness, while still clinging to our own tribal identities, our sense of autonomy. That's opportunity. And I think it can play out pragmatically as well. Emphasize unity and emphasize the fact that the left and the right, you each have important voices here. Unity does not mean one over the other, one or the other.
Yeah. And I would say, just based on that I think the key is finding the right balance between those two, right? Which is, it's sort of on a spectrum. It's a little bit like in negotiation, we often talk about needing to be both assertive but empathic, right? I think it's in that regard, it's a similar kind of dynamic, right? That if you lose your autonomy in an effort to affiliate, then that's when people get worried, right?
Exactly.
That they're going to give up. Yeah. Well, listen, Dan, this was terrific, and I really appreciate you taking the time as always. And I think, for those of the folks who have been in the Masters in Leadership and Negotiation program, we spend a lot of time on the psychological realm because, I'm a believer like you that that's where so much of conflict rests, and we just don't spend nearly enough time. We tend to focus on the practical and the tangible, and I think, frankly, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that's rife with psychological wounds that have not been healed, and they're not going to reach agreement that's going to last until those things have been healed, in addition to the practical and the tangible, et cetera. So, my message a lot of the time is that, yes, you have to learn how to deal with the people, across the table from you, and the dynamics like power and culture and gender, et cetera, but you also have to turn the mirror on yourself and understand the biases and the other kinds of things that are impacting and impeding your ability to play a constructive role in dealing with a conflict. So, like I said, as always, I'm very grateful for you to take the time, and I really recommend Dan's book. I've read it 3 times now, I think,
Thank you.
to make sure I really understand it and everything. And it helps a tremendous amount, because I think what he does is he, in very simple ways, illuminates complicated subjects that lie at the heart of so many difficult conflicts.
Thank you, Josh. It's an honor to be a part of your series and to the World Affairs Council as well. Thank you.
Great. Well, everybody, thank you for hanging in there. I know it's been a little bit, but I hope you were as energized as I was by Dan. He's hard not to be energized by, and we look forward to having you at future hot topics down the road. So keep your eyes peeled for those. And again, thanks to BayPath and the World Affairs Council for sponsoring this, and particularly to you, Dan, and of course to Elise Carrier for organizing everything. So have a great night, everyone. Take care.
Thanks all.
Thank you.